Thank you very much, Charles, for doing this. It's such a pleasure and an honor for us to have you in the Institute for the first time. This is the first of the lectures that we're going to have during the next weeks. We're going to have some special guests in the context of a festival, we may say, around the problem of landscape architecture or landscape design or landscape urbanism. And we are also giving an online course that some of the students are getting in this conversation, and hopefully after Charles' presentation, we're going to engage in a conversation. So I'm going to start presenting Charles very briefly. Charles Waldheim is a North American architect and urbanist based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Waldheim research examines the relationships between landscape ecology and contemporary urbanism. On these topics, Waldheim is author, editor, or co-editor of numerous publications on these topics, including Landscape as Urbanism, General Theory, edited by Princeton University Press, and the Landscape Urbanism Reader, edited by Princeton Architectural Press. Waldheim developed the theory of landscape urbanism in response to the industrial economies and emergent ecologies of the American city. On this topic, he curates the Harvard GSD's Future of the American City platform with support from the Ignite Foundation. He is Sean E. Irvine Professor at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where he directs the school's Office for Urbanization. He also serves as the Rutger Curator of Landscape at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, where he convenes the larger landscape conversation. Waldheim is recipient of the Rome Prize Fellowship from the American Academy in Rome, the Visiting Scholar Research Fellowship at the Canadian Center for Architecture, the Sanders Fellowship at the University of Michigan, and the Cullinan Chair at Rice University. He has been a visiting scholar at the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London and the Bauhaus Foundation in Dessau, Germany. In addition to his research, Waldheim advises public and private clients on questions of contemporary urbanism and collaborates with multidisciplinary teams on urban projects around the world. His work has been published, exhibited, and presented internationally, and he has collaborated on urban projects with a range of leading designers, including the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, Morphosis, Gross Max, Preston Scott Cohen, STOS, Landscape Urbanism, and James Corner Field Operation, among many others. Today, we have the pleasure to have him presenting his last book, 50 Species Towns, a book that focuses on China's rapid urbanization that has come to the expense of its agricultural countryside. 50 Species Towns presents an alternative model for agricultural modernization and agrarian new town planning in China. The model is derived from a close reading of Chinese agricultural history and village life in support of the vital economic, environmental, and societal reforms currently underway. The research project is informed by the extraordinary wealth of culinary diversity and heritage crops found across China. 50 Species Towns aspires to reconcile the enlightened goal of improving the quality of life in the countryside without sacrificing the collective meaning derived from centuries of agrarian and culinary cultural heritage. This presentation is given in the context of the multiple landscape festival that we are opening today at the Institute of Architecture. In the coming weeks, we are going to have Francesco Garofalo from the landscape international design firm Open Fabric and Jose Alfredo Ramirez from both the landscape design firm Ground Lab and the Architectural Association Landscape Program. So I cannot think of a better first guest for this series than Charles. Thank you very much for doing this. It is a pleasure to talk with you again.
Thank you so much, Santiago. It's lovely to see you again, and I can't tell you how happy I am to be with you. So, gracias por todo. Muy buenas tardes. Thanks to the Institute and to everyone who's joining. I like, Santiago, the way that you refer to landscape as a kind of problem or a kind of question. This for me is a fundamental, place to begin. The idea that, landscape is really a way of thinking. It's a way of understanding our relationality in the world. Being trained as an architect, when I was first introduced to landscape or landscape architecture, the first thing I was taught was, well, don't talk to those people. They deal with plant material. And I think, on one level that might be true, but thinking about landscape architects as primarily having knowledge about plants is a little bit like thinking about architects primarily knowing about bricks. Yes, we know something about bricks, but really the cultural form is much more powerful and important than that. So it's a great pleasure to be with you and to share with you our most recent research project. As Santiago mentioned, 50 Species Towns is it's a research project that comes out of several years of collaboration with a number of partners in mainland China, and in response to the State Party's 2016 program of agricultural modernization. The first thing to say about the project is that it does take the form of a book, and I'll share some of the contents with you this afternoon. The book is the work of my research group called Office for Urbanization, and that means it's a part of a research group that's attached to the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and includes a range of people that have contributed to the project. So my co-authors include Charlie Gilliard, who's a doctoral candidate at the GSD, Mariano Gomez Luque, who's now running a unit at IAC in Barcelona and is a graduate of the doctoral program here, Mercedes Peralta, Min Yao, and Boya Zhang, all of whom are now doctoral candidates. So our research group includes researchers, but also doctoral candidates who contributed this. In addition, I'll be sharing with you the work of dozens of graduate students, as well as over a dozen GSD faculty who have contributed to the project. "50 Species Towns" proposes a new paradigm, a new way of thinking about the development of agricultural new towns in the context of China. It imagines an approach based on the propagation of 50 heritage crops, and we'll define those terms in a minute. And it considers these crops and their associated material cultures as really invaluable forms of cultural heritage. As Santiago mentioned, the book is built upon quite a lot of research into the history of both urbanization and agricultural development in China. And our premise is that each era in the history of Chinese agricultural development has sponsored its own urban forms, but also its own imaginaries. And these imaginaries become encoded, they become described in various ways, including in representations. They each come with a different form of drawing, a different kind of visual representational strategy. And so political projects, economic reforms, social projects, and agrarian reform are mixed together in various eras in Chinese history. And they often then produce their own forms of visual representation. This, for example, is a poster from 1953, a part of the advertising campaign or the propaganda, if you will, for the new view in the rural village and the kind of back to the land movement. There's more to be said about that, but I'm interested here in this history. This is from 1973, the new look of the borderline. And what you see here is each era in Chinese agricultural development comes with a certain kind of visual rhetoric or a certain kind of visual representation that we're quite interested in. As I mentioned, our work began when our partners in China reached out to us, many of whom were developing new towns. These are small agricultural new towns in response to the 13th five-year plan for the development of the People's Republic. This was in 2016, and it included a range of reforms which were generally in the category of agricultural modernization. It included a number of very, I think, important and laudable goals, very admirable goals, including improving the rural working conditions and the living standards throughout the country. as you may know, that the villages, the kind of the peasant villages, have been the last part of China to be incorporated into Deng Xiaoping's openings of the new economy. In some ways, they're in a kind of pre-capitalist state. And so the proposal from 2016 that the party put forward was to cultivate and develop specialized economies, very local, county by county, that are characteristic of local areas, and also to develop a more ecologically friendly agriculture. These are all quotes from that 2016 5-year plan, with the goal of reducing the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. At the same moment, of course, the Chinese are consulting with American and European universities and using genetically modified crops and trying to increase their own caloric and nutritional capacity. The plan also proposes the promotion of close cooperation between agriculture and new economies, including leisure, tourism, education, culture, and public health, as well as the integration of information technology into agricultural production management, operations management, and market distribution. So you can see how, in some ways, they're trying to do what the US and parts of Europe did in the 20th century, while also being more progressive in an environmental way. They also proposed the complete mechanization of the production process of certain major crops, and those are mostly rice, wheat, the big staple crops that will feed most of China. In order to do this, the Chinese acknowledge that they will need to strengthen their water infrastructure, as well as their development of parks and green infrastructure and other supporting facilities. They will need to promote the integration of rural infrastructure to increase power supply, roads, communication, as well as to improve the ability of local or county economies to support and lead economic development in their surrounding areas. They have enormous social and economic challenges where life back on the farm is not keeping pace with the advancement of living in the cities. The cities have been quite prosperous. A generation or two have left the villages for the city, leaving often their children behind with the grandparents. And this produces great inequity, but a whole host of social, economic, and political challenges. Our recommendation to that 5-year plan has been that the use of monoculture crops and the environmental pollution, the overuse of pesticides, the overuse of fertilizers, pose real significant threats to Chinese agricultural heritage. This has to do also with identities and who's living in these places. And we've built quite an interesting kind of research into how migration and patterns of urbanization are occurring within China. So we're interested in the Chinese goal of taking pressure of population off of the major cities and producing these small, relatively small new towns of, let's say, 50,000 residents or less than 100,000 residents as agricultural new towns. 50 species towns is based on this concept of intangible cultural heritage. This includes practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the artifacts and cultural spaces. This is defined by UNESCO as a part of a place's cultural heritage, and it's described in great literature. And of course, China has a number of various forms of intangible cultural heritage. China has also done a very good job of documenting their own culinary or agricultural history. And the Chinese literature identifies 80 specifically designated sites with very specific traditional crops. And I'm showing you a list of these crops here. And so the premise of our project is that these crops are the most valuable form of intangible cultural heritage that are at risk of being erased in the move to monoculture and genetically modified crops, and that they are in great danger ultimately as China modernizes its agriculture. Our project is based on a very important precedent project, which is developed by my friend, Dr. Kang Zhanyu. Dr. Kang Zhanyu is a landscape architect. His firm is called Touriscape. It's based in Beijing. And it's what I believe is maybe the most interesting or maybe the most important practice of landscape architecture practicing in China today. About 20 years ago, Kang Zhanyu and Touriscape were invited to manage the planning and design and construction of the landscape for a new university campus, the Shenyang Architectural University campus. you can see here was this commission. Now, the site was formerly agricultural fields, and they were kind of erased of their existing population. The university planned the buildings, did a master plan, and after all the architecture was done, the university had very little money left. So they invited my friend Kong Jianyu to consult on a landscape strategy. And he did something which I think is still remarkable 20 years ago, which is he simply returned to the campus the wet rice paddy agricultural production of rice that had been erased. This is an extraordinary thing to do. On the one hand, it produces this beautiful landscape condition. It also, of course, has the effect of being a kind of comment or a kind of critique of the erasure of that agricultural heritage. It's a beautiful place. It's got a kind of campus-like quality that you might find in the West or in other parts of the world. It's a proper university campus with public spaces and promenades and boulevards. And there's a certain quality of space, which on the one hand is a modern university campus, but at the same moment, it's a space in which there's a remarkable biodiversity and intermixing of crops and species, and some very intimate spaces for study and for gathering. But what's maybe most interesting for our purposes is that the rice has now become, in part, the identity of the university. It's sold in the bookshop. It's planted and harvested in these annual festivals. It's become the identity or the mascota for the football team, right? So the university campus, instead of erasing this cultural heritage, brings this cultural heritage back as a kind of representation, right? As a kind of mascota for this particular institution. And so that's the concept behind our 50 species towns. Instead of building Newtown 47B, which I don't want to live in Newtown 47B, our proposal is that each new town could be identified very closely with a very specific heritage crop from which it could derive its identity. You can see here heritage crops in China that are quite well documented in the literature. And our project begins with identifying the 50 most important of those, and then imagines a new town in which every decision, every choice that we make about the shape of the town, its organization, its location in China, its soils, its water, its humidity, its thermal proportions, ultimately its urban form, the shape of buildings and streets and boulevards, that these might be derived not from historic precedent or from local typologies, but rather from the species itself. So I'll share with you briefly 3 examples from the book. You can see here the first, which is the jujube or Chinese date, Sisyphus jujuba. This grows in the northern latitudes between 29 and 50 northern latitude in a temperate, semi-arid Köppen-Geiger climate zone. And we're using climate zone and soil and latitude as surrogates for kind of climate in a more proximate or local way. You can see here our methodology, which is to include the color specific to the species, to show the botanical drawing, to locate geographically where the species grows. And on the right-hand side, you can see this encyclopedic kind of index that lists all 50 of these, as well as some details about the types of soil that it thrives in, the types of solar relationship. In Jia County, the jujube fruit has been cultivated for over 3,000 years, and there are ancient gardens containing trees that are over 1,000 years old, with cultivars representing each stage in the history of the jujube domestication. The jujube fruit has more vitamin C than the orange, more sugar than the sugar cane or the sugar beet, and yet it grows in the arid conditions where those more commercial fruits cannot survive. Thriving on the Los Plateau, jujube gardens grow in the world's largest deposit of dust-sized particles. This is wind-borne material from the U.S. desert. And what we're interested in here is things like this, the Jujube Cake Festi in Jia County. This is an annual festival. There are dozens and dozens or hundreds of these kinds of examples across China of cultural traditions and pageantry and events built upon this history of a particular crop. And we're interested in the cake, of course, and the meaning behind it and its history, but we're also interested in the patterns of cultivation, the idea of how and where these gardens have been grown. So we're showing here the morphology of the plant. We're showing you the patterns of cultivation, the kind of landscape portrait, as well as the materiality itself, right? That the certain coloration of the jujube date becomes something very specific, and it seeps its way into the clothing, into the material, the building fabric, into the very soil of the place. And beyond that, we're also interested in the kind of morphology of the plant, the growth logic, as we call it. And we're also interested here in the primary agricultural building typology in these regions. China has documented in the literature 18 specific building typologies that are associated with various regions of agricultural production. In this case, the skinny courtyard is a major residence type in Guangdong, a historical region corresponding to the Crescentic Basin within the central Shaanxi province. In this case, we're interested to scan thousands of examples of that skinny courtyard typology, and you can see a composite of those buildings here on the left. And then we derive from that a new kind of urban block matrix. We have on the right a kind of a range of density from very small individual buildings and villas all the way through kind of, let's call it medium density block structures. And those are coming from both the 2016 State Party Fifth Five-Year Plan, but also from conventional modes of urbanization and super block development that are conventional in China today. And then ultimately, following that growth logic, we grow a town in a kind of petri dish, a tabletop exercise. You can see here in a kind of idealized kind of platonic form. And then we develop that in a site-specific way for a very particular site in China that has real hydrology, real topography, and try to answer every question about built form, hydrological performance, agricultural pattern from this logic of the jujube. And in so doing, try to reconcile modernization with the loss of collective memory and the loss of agricultural and cultural heritage. As I mentioned, a part of this work is looking at the kind of morphology and typology of agricultural towns in China's history. The rapeseed grows in the kind of middle section of China in a climate zone which is associated with subpolar winter dry. And the rapeseed is also associated with these kind of extraordinary cultural productions. You can see here the Zhongshan show in a field of rapeseed. The rapeseed is interesting because it produces over half of China's canola oil, and it's traditionally farmed in these kind of terraces in which the aquaculture, the farming of fish, shrimps, crab, produce sediment and fertilizer that's then dug up and then deposited on the raised field, agricultural fields. And this is an ancient form of agricultural practice, but it also is one that is environmentally quite beneficial because it reduces the amount of fertilizer required. It also reduces the amount of waste being required. In this case, in Zhuotian, rapeseed grows alongside wheat, millet, yams, leeks, lettuce, even fruit trees. And of course, we're interested in the growth kind of pattern of that, as well as the idea of emerging a new town, growing a new town in this kind of low aqueous kind of wet rice or raised field agricultural production. That work is informed by this study that I've been sharing with you of 18 different agrarian typologies, kind of urban form as identified in block structure in the literature across China that we've been studying in quite detail. And we're interested in the difference between, on the right, the kind of ideal body, let's say, that you see in the books from the 1980s, and on the left, the scanning of hundreds of examples of actually found buildings in the world. This is in collaboration with my colleague, Andrew Witt. These are photographs by Toul and Bruno Morandi. They're based in Paris. Toul grew up on the steppes of Mongolia and then immigrated to Paris to study photography and the fine arts. Bruno is based in France, and they now practice together in Paris. And they've been traveling in China for a long time, and in this case, taking photographs of the old tea house in a part of Chengdu in Sichuan province. This practice of identifying a particular crop, in this case, certain varietals of tea, and then building an economy around the agricultural production, around the value-added product, this is quite normal in Argentina. You know, I've had the pleasure of visiting your vineyards in Mendoza, and I've been to Napa Valley in California, and I've had champagne from France. That idea of value-added kind of products coming from these agricultural heritage products is a relatively new idea in China. But what's interesting about it is that it's being rapidly adopted as a part of this agricultural modernization project. and in which the kind of heritage landscapes, like this kind of tea terrace landscape, which is quite iconic, are being incorporated. The third crop that I'll share with you is the Tianjin pepper. You can see the quote by Mao Zedong: "The food of the true revolutionary is the red pepper, and he who cannot endure red peppers is unable to fight," which is kind of an extraordinary, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it's certainly a sentiment that was widely held. The Tianjin pepper grows in the southern latitudes in the subtropical and humid climate zones. Was not originally native to China, but rather native to South America, to Bolivia and Paraguay. It was first introduced in the 14th and 15th century to be used primarily for medicinal or ornamental plant purposes. And then over centuries, it's become absorbed into food preservation and food spicing. And it now has a variety of hotness, but also a variety of flavors. And in the version cultivated here in Jintian County, there are a unique 3-flavor profile. It has won a series of awards and was declared a National Geographical protected product, for example. So in the way that 20 years ago, the preservation of historic buildings was a new idea for many Chinese, now the idea of preserving these culinary heritage crops is a new idea and is encapsulated in this notion of Tianjin pepper. Of course, we're interested likewise in the coloration, the agricultural fields, the terraces, the labor of this work, but also the idea of the kind of agricultural pattern that produces, as well as the growth logic of the species itself. And as we've done in the other cases, try to develop a distinct urban morphology, a distinct block typology that both acknowledges the history of agricultural development and urban form in the region, but also looks to new or emergent urban form, and in which the identity of this place might be given not through agricultural modernization or not through a state program or a party 5-year plan, but rather through a very, very meaningful and very, very specific culinary heritage species. And what I'll say by way of conclusion and opening to a conversation, hopefully, is in addition to being a proposal, a critique really of agricultural modernization and new town development in China, our project is really a kind of a speculation on the role of thinking about urban form. In our culture, at least, we seem to have lost the capacity or the appetite for thinking about urban form as a cultural project, or thinking about the kind of future of the city as an imaginary and architectural project. That's something I'm deeply committed to. We tend to either have, fallen back to, thinking that the city is really the product of pure capital speculation on the one hand, it's just flows of money outside the realm of culture, or that it's purely the realm of government policies or decisions taken at a political level. And I'm making a third argument here, which is for the role of design, the role of architecture in thinking through the idea of urban futures. And in so doing, returning to that notion that, Santiago mentioned of the idea of the landscape problem, or the landscape, kind of mindset, the way of landscape thinking, the landscape question, as a way not so much to think about plants, but rather a way to think about architecture from a new point of view. So Santiago, hopefully you're still with us. I'm with you.
Yes, I'm here.
Fantastic. So we made it that far at least.
Yeah. Thank you for the patience. These things happen all the time, but I guess we got it. We got it all. So excellent. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was fantastic. Maybe I can start with a question that I had watching another presentations of the same book in other contexts that you made. That is regarding the proposals itself. Maybe you can elaborate on how they work specifically regarding the ideas you exposed in your previous book, Landscape as Urbanism, where you not only presented a history of the landscape as urbanism, but also you are presenting a proposal, a design proposal for landscape. And I believe that much of what you expose in that book is embedded in these projects, of course. But maybe you can elaborate a little bit on how they work a little more specifically, because I believe that there are like prototypes first that they are able to vary, and then you build idealize totalities, and then these totalities are deployed in a territorialization system. But I don't know if you can elaborate on the difference between them, or if they operate all the same in this sense.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. So as you know, landscape urbanism is now over 25 years old as a set of ideas. And so let's start there, right? So 25 years ago, it wasn't obvious that architects would be thinking about landscape or thinking about ecology. Both architecture and urbanism, they had very strong cultural projects, but they seemed to, this was in the 1990s when we were developing the ideas around landscape urbanism, and my friend Mohsen was starting the unit at the AA, and I was beginning my project in Chicago with a new program. In that moment, really, landscape urbanism was really about the kind of bringing of landscape thinking, a kind of relational or environmental thinking, into architectural thought, because it was clear to me that both architecture and urban design were very slow to embrace a kind of environmental position, right? So landscape urbanism was a new way of thinking, in some ways an old way of thinking about the city, but also a kind of new way. And what we tried to accomplish was to allow architects to begin to think ecologically. And ecological urbanism has been a continuation of that project in the last decade or so. And that began with a set of ideas. So it was an intellectual project. We developed certain paradigms or workflows or ways of working. The DRL, the Design Research Lab at the AA, was incorporated to help inform, so we developed a kind of parametricism, you can imagine, in which ecological performance was helping to drive, urban outcomes. And that project became very successful, and it got very good at the things that were, fluid. It got very good at the river. It got very good at the water. It got very good at dealing with species. And my thinking now, or in the last 5 years, has been that project is ongoing, but it's kind of middle-aged. It's an important project, but we now have practices, we have offices, we have schools of design, and we're quite good at doing that kind of thing. But what we're missing, I think now, is a very explicit ecological or environmental performance metric for thinking about urban form, the built form. So landscape urbanism is strongest when it incorporates a very strong agenda about how to derive urban form. And at the same time, landscape historically has been outside of that, right? My experience in Latin America, my experience in Argentina, the culture is one of the kind of strong architectural culture in which landscape happens outside the city. And that opposition is something that I've been trying to get past, because I think it's a mistake to think that way. That landscape is a human construct. It's not in the Andes, right? It's in the city. And so in the last 5 years or so, I've been trying to develop, ideas and workflow so that urban form could be seen to be coming from the same environmental performance, the same ecological performance as landscape urbanism was derived from. Because I found too many of my colleagues and friends were very good dealing with landscape urbanism, but when it came to the block structure or the shape of the buildings, the shape of the city, we then kind of reverted to, well, we'll let the developers decide, or, the building historic precedent will decide. And I've been pushing on that a little. So there's a very clear connection between them in my mind. And I'm simply shifting from the wet work of the, structure of the city now to the shape of the block and the building form itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. In fact, you mentioned typology. That is a word that is kind of a lot of people avoid talking. A lot of contemporary designers, you may say, avoid typology because they associate that to something fixed, right? Some fixed organization from the past. But it's nice to see how you're referring to typology as something that you can build, and you can build it from understanding landscape. And I believe that has to do with thinking the unit block, the city block. It's not just a volume, but there is typology embedded on it, right?
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, thank you for that, Santiago. That's my goal, because I think it's true. You know, we've tended to either come from camps or schools that imagine, you know, typology as a very dusty old idea and no longer useful. And then that produces a lot of projects, a lot of, you know, projects that I see where, you know, basically the architecture thinks it can do everything, and then it sort of loses its point of view on what might be collective or what might be urban. I see a lot of that work, and that's, you know, something I'm trying to work against. But I don't think that having an understanding of history or a reading of typology prevents us from being innovative. You know, I think it's a dialectic between the two. And so for me, it's not as though any one of those layers of analysis is alone able to answer all the questions, you know. But at the same time, you know, I have this conversation often with, I'm friendly with Iñaki Abalos, so we've talked about this, or Tom Main, I'm friends with Tom Main, and we talk about this a lot, where Tom's work is interested in the kind of the internal environmental drivers or the external environmental performance pushing the architecture to a point that it kind of implodes, kind of takes over, and it produces its own landscape in a way. And I have enormous respect for that, and I think some of it is quite good. But there's always the challenge of, well, how do you deal with collective space, or how do you deal with property, or how do you deal with the structure of the city? And I find too often, if we don't have a position about that, we then revert back to, you know, either it doesn't matter, where there is no structure, it's kind of campus space, or we revert back to the law of the Indies, and we all have to live on the same grid, right? So that tension, I find, produces a kind of gap where I do think we need new models for, like, what you might think of as, you know, town planning.
Yeah, well, talking about myths, there's also a tendency to think that landscape urbanisms tend to be like a scientific method, like you generate maps and the maps themselves are the projects, so there's nothing to argue there, you know, like there's no inventive because I'm producing a map that is absolute truth, you may say.
Yep.
So I don't know if you can, if there's a way to measure this, but
Yep.
what is the role of inventiveness in the project, or the role of speculative design in what you are doing, and specifically in these proposals that you state in the book?
It's a great prompt, Santiago. Thank you for that. I think it's a great question. I will go back to sort of the relationship between design and science. You know, one of the challenges in working with landscape is that landscape is informed by the natural sciences, and that can produce a kind of confusion where bringing in knowledge from environmental science or ecological science can often kind of shut down design, as if, well, that's true, and therefore, and the idea there is that in every project I've ever worked on, in every culture, every consulting project, every research project, we have far more scientific knowledge than we could ever use. You know, like the data is infinite, but the data won't tell you what to do, because what to do is really a set of political or cultural or social choices. And so reconciling that is a part of what designers are quite good at. Like, as architects, we're often working with multivariate problems. We begin work before we have all the information. And so I've come to believe of design and science as kind of opposed to one another, right? So the scientific model is that you want to know something about the world, so you go out and you measure and you test and you falsify, and you're building models of the world that are increasingly refined, but they're increasingly narrow. So if you want to know something about one species, we have infinite knowledge about this one species. But if you want to talk about something as complex as a city, we know that we can't wait for all the information. And we know historically that there's no correlation between having more information and making better decisions at that scale. And this is something I think is often challenging for architects and for landscape architects, a kind of misrecognition where the power of architecture is that you and I know this is a cultural project. Like, yes, we want engineering and we want science and we want the best available ideas about viruses and mosquitoes and how the fish will survive, and we want environmental knowledge. But we don't imagine that our work is the kind of math problem or some kind of algorithm that will produce itself, right? And I think, mapping and the scientific information of modeling kind of the early landscape urbanism work from the AA has been quite productive, it's quite generative, but at the same time, it's still project making fundamentally. And I think sometimes that project making can get stuck in its own kind of story. So the narrative becomes kind of closed and it's true, but you can't really enter into it. And we know that projects in the world are messier than that.
That's great. Yeah, that's a weird problem that we have when teaching this kind of things. I have one more question. Maybe we can have questions from the students here. If they can, if they're too shy to talk, you can write it in the chat box, and I will translate it. But I have a question that is maybe broader. I want to know what is your position regarding this idea of raw material production and industrialized product, because Argentina is historically known as a country that exports raw products, right? Like products that are not industrialized, that are not processed. And many of third world countries are stuck in that system, a system that is agrarian and in a sense stays there because first world countries benefit from that. So the phase of industrialization of these countries is what makes them start to taking part in some sort of global commercialization or global participation, where you can stand in another position with other countries in the world. So I don't know what is the position of China, but I know China is a great power now in the world, and I'm sure that there are places where industrialization is far more advanced, and places where the agrarian system of raw material is still in place. So, what is your position in that, dichotomy, you may say, and how is China dealing with that, and how the projects that you are proposing deals with that issue?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. One of the reasons that I've been focusing on food, I've been, I think one of our central challenges culturally is, like how do we continue to, in a way, modernize, but while also acknowledging cultural history, right? So for me, the Enlightenment is still an incomplete project. I believe deeply committed to the idea of mobility, both social mobility, education, integration. Of course, this comes at a cost, and a part of the cost is the interconnectedness of the world tends to often erase local culture, and it also can tend to produce one culture is meant to be the raw ingredients for some other culture, right? In these kind of colonial relationships that you refer to. Landscape urbanism has done quite a lot, and we've got a new book out called Technical Lands, looking at sites of extraction and that relationship between extraction and production. So there's been some work done on that, but I find with the culinary stuff, with food, like there's something deeply, deeply human and deeply personal, and there's something that we can agree that as long as we agree as a species to be around, we're going to feed ourselves, right? So there's something about that that's shared. And of course, the Chinese historically have had many challenges, right? With various moments in history, with simply feeding themselves has become quite a big challenge. And at the same moment, in recent years, in recent decades, they've been, around the world, improving infrastructure, making investments, engaging in kind of soft power, let's say, but also building hard infrastructure to enable the extraction of raw materials, to enable the extraction of certain, both precious metals, but other forms of materials. They've also been, of course, buying up and building infrastructure for agricultural production in other parts of the world, right? Certainly in Africa and other parts of Asia, among others. On the one hand, I think we all share an interest in the Chinese feeding themselves. No matter where your politics are, I don't think it's reasonable to imagine that these people shouldn't be able to feed themselves. And so I think we all have a vested interest in their self-sufficiency, their own, food security, let's say. But it is true, the further afield, if they have to go to Africa or Latin America or Asia to be able to feed their domestic population on a regular basis, this will produce negative externalities often. It will often produce these conditions where some culture, in the US has been guilty of this as well, some culture or some country is purely there to be supplying raw materials in a way that's subsidized artificially to this other dominant culture. So anything that we do that allow all of us to think about our agricultural production and reconcile the challenge of growth and efficiency and capacity for food security, but also not to do so in a way that erases our own history and deeply lived experience. That dialectic is what I'm interested in. And I'm interested in it also because there's been a long and problematic history of architects from, certain places going to other places and telling people how they should build. So on the one hand, with the history of modernism, we've learned many of the failures of that, right? The German architect, gets off an airplane and says, I have your answers, and there's a problematic history. At the same time, I'm not convinced that we should all retreat into our hometowns or our local valley. There's some architects who have said, I'm only going to work in this region, in this river valley. I'm only going to work in this place. And there's a kind of nativism or a kind of fundamentalism about that certain architects would say, I'm only able to work in my culture. And I respect that, but I'm committed to this project of sharing knowledge and enlightenment, informing, the advance of improving conditions for us in the world materially. So that leads me to thinking about, well, how can I, an urbanist from the West, say something in Asia, but not just being an outsider? And I think the idea of what we feed our children, right, the most fundamental, most human act, that might be a source of meaning that would be enough for us to begin to have a conversation in which these things are more specifically Chinese and maybe less Western.
Yeah, and the possibility to learn, right?
Of course.
I mean,
yeah.
China is a great case study for landscape that is so far from Western culture. And
that's right. And so that allows us to adopt a position of kind of humility, and to say, this is not my history. This is not what I ate. This is your history. And that's why I go back to that precedent, the project of this university campus, where it succeeded. It succeeded because it was seen to be meaningful and it was seen to be genuine. It was generous.
And how the book is being received in contexts that are not Western rooted.
We have the book in Mandarin and in English, and it's been well disseminated and it's been very positively received. And I would say at the level of political leadership, at the level of intellectual leadership in the universities, as we presented it in Beijing and in the universities and in the various institutes of the government, that's gone very, very well. And I would say at the level of the land developers and architects that are building, projects in China, it's been well received. And as we go down the kind of organization of architects to people that are on a daily basis, kind of in the field making architectural choices, I would say there's more skepticism because it's not the way they've been doing things, historically. So I think that's where we are. And at the same moment, the pandemic has slowed the conversation a little bit, but I'm optimistic.
Okay, fantastic, Charles. Well, I don't know if we have any questions from people here. Okay, Arturo, go ahead. Do you think about the integration of clean energies for these models that you presented, or have you thought about how it could be integrated?
Yeah, thanks, Arturo. It's a good question, and I would say that you know, our primary focus has been on the thermodynamic response of the urban form. So something I didn't spend a lot of time on is that we have quite a lot of detailed information about the different climate zones, different latitudes, and how block structure responds to those. And this is pretty well established, you know, kind of environmental engineering and science. And so at that level, we have very clear ideas about how we might use the available thermodynamic energy that's in the atmosphere in each of these different local typologies, as what very clear ideas also about how the existing vernacular, the existing historical typologies already incorporated proportion of surface area to interior volume, or openness or transparency for ventilation, the amount of southern or solar exposure. These are all things we have very detailed metrics about. There are other people that have been working on the problem of electric production. Unfortunately, China is still producing quite a lot of its electricity through carbon intensive, through coal, through oil, natural gas, and in that regard, they're a bit behind. But they are also the culture that seems to be very, very quickly moving to batteries, to be able to kind of move to renewable energy production, wind and solar and the like. And so they've been behind. But I would say, when the Chinese party decides, they tend to move very, very quickly. And they're not at a place where, let's say, Germany is, for example, where there are certain regions in Germany that are producing the vast majority of their, electricity needs for the day through renewable energy. They're not at a place where parts of Spain have been recently, where they're producing more renewable energy than they can consume in a day. But at the same time, they've made a commitment to it. So in that regard, there's nothing about energy production in the project explicitly. But in other projects, I am interested in the relationship between the surface of the building as a site of energy production, but also as a place that produces shadow. So we have a project called the New Heliomorphism, and we've done a conference on the topic because I think there's a debate looming about the shape of buildings in relationship to the sun. Historically, it was a very old topic that was sorted out a long time ago, a century ago. It was just decided. But now we have, certain architects are using the surface of the building for photovoltaics to produce green or low carbon energy, and I support that. But those buildings tend to produce enormous shadows because of this in the public realm. We have other architects that are carving their buildings away to allow sunlight into the public realm, and that tension I find really quite interesting right now. The last thing I'll mention is there is a piece in the project which is about the use of agricultural waste and other fibers and other kind of materials in a kind of biodigestive or biogenerative way. This is something that's pretty common now in the West. In Western Europe, certainly there are many, many examples of these plants that take waste products, agricultural waste products and lawn clippings and compost, and they turn them into a form of biogenerated heat. There are many great projects of this in Western Europe and a few in the US and in Canada. And I see that's something that the Chinese are adopting that is a part of our projects. I think there is a place for kind of biodigestive and biogenerative energy production, but it's a relatively small percentage of the overall energy portfolio.
Yeah, you mentioned the massivity, right? Like China, everything in China is an extreme. It's like everything is a lot, like everything is massive. So that's something to looking at the drawings of these proposals in the book. Everything is huge, So I believe that question about energy is very important because every decision that the Chinese make is a big change for the environment instantly.
It's true, Arturo, and given the scale, this is a national project. Agricultural modernization. They have big distribution losses because they have to move the energy so far, and at the same moment, they already have challenges around infrastructure as they're trying to incorporate, information technology and economy that will simply increasing the standard of living in these rural villages includes more and more electrification. So it's a very, very smart question. but it is a question at scale, and it's one that I think that we all have, big challenges about.
Great, Charles. Thank you, says Arturo. Okay. Anyone else? Any question? Any last minute question? Or we can let Charles go. Okay, it seems that we are okay. So thank you very much, Charles, for doing this. It was great. It's great to chat with you. And sorry for the technical inconvenience. This happens all the time. We're going to edit all the presentation in order to be perfectly coordinated and with no problems in the middle.
Not at all, Santiago. Gracias por todo. Thank you so much for the opening, and it's lovely to see you again. And I'll look forward to watching the rest of your series. It looks like an impressive group of people. And yeah, all best with the Institute.
Thank you very much, Charles. See you soon. Thank you.